And Paul has a very good word for us in that regard. Look at verse 12 of chapter 6. Paul says, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Then he says, food's for the body, and the body for foods, but God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord. Now you get the idea of what he's talking about. Fornication is a Greek word, porneia, from which we get pornography, that means sexual sin. It is a big word, like a blanket, covers every possible sexual sin. Paul is saying we are not to be engaged in sexual sin. And he gives three reasons in this text, and I want you to see them. Number one, it harms. Number two, it controls. And number three, it perverts. First of all, notice verse 12, which I just read to you. And here Paul tells us that all things are lawful, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful, but I will not be brought under the power of any. In other words, he's saying, as far as Christian liberty goes, we're free to do certain things. But if we were to do those things, they would harm us. They would not be for our good. He uses the word expedient. This is the word sumphero. It literally means to bring together. And from that literal meaning, it came to mean to profit. And what he's saying is there are things which are okay, but they're not profitable. Now, Aristotle used the word, for example, in connection with the pay of sailors and the booty of soldiers. He was talking then about the profit they make. And that's basically what it means. It means to be profited by. The English word is very interesting. Expedient. The middle part of the word, P-E-D, is a word that has to do with feet. We talk about heads and refer to our feet. There is, in the English language, putting this word together, a very interesting meaning. Exped means to be free feet. Now, the concept of free feet means this in its root. It means that your feet are free from any entanglement. In other words, there are certain things that I might do, but if I did them, I wouldn't have free feet. I'd get tangled up. There are things that would harm me. So that all things are permissible in a sense within God's grace, but not all things help us. Some things entangle us, some things hinder us. I'm a Christian, right? I'm redeemed. I'm redeemed eternally. I'm free to do what I want. I have liberty, and God is going to redeem me because His love is eternal. But even though I have that freedom, there are some things I don't do because they'll tangle my feet up. They'll bind me. They'll harm me. And immorality is one of those things. Immorality never helps. It only harms. Look at verse 18 of 1 Corinthians 6. Flee fornication. Why? Well, because you're sinning at the end of the verse against your own body. It's going to harm you. Flee from it. You know, people say, well, I can live any way I want. I'm a Christian, and I am under grace, and God forgives everything, and I've been set free. I'm free from the power of the law because Christ bore my penalty. I'm free from the power of sin because He paid the price. I'm free from eternal judgment because He bore the judgment of God in His own body. I'm free, but Paul says, yeah, that's right, but you're not free to do things that will harm you. You know, the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about how immorality harms us. In the 5th chapter of Proverbs, in the 6th chapter of Proverbs, in the 7th chapter of Proverbs, and in the 9th chapter of Proverbs, there is quite a long list of very practical things to show us that fornication is harmful. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 8 it says, neither let us commit fornication as some of them, that is the Israelites, committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Paul says, don't commit fornication and find yourself in the same situation Israel was when 23,000 of them died in one day. In the 12th chapter, I think it is, of 1 Corinthians, there's another word about this same thing. Well, we won't take time to look it up at this point. I'm not sure that's the right one. That was a good guess. But anyway, there's another place somewhere in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about this. But sin has a devastating effect, particularly the sin of immorality. I think back, and this one in Psalm 51 comes to mind, of David, who had committed the sin of immorality with Bathsheba. And in that very, very terrifying and terrible situation that resulted from that, where the man, Uriah, her husband, was killed, and David lived with this incredible guilt. Psalm 51 says he became sick, and he became weak, and he became lonely, and he became sad, and he became guilty. The horrible harm that came to David. And then there was Hophni and Phinehas, who were the two sons of Eli, the high priest. And they decided that even though their father was the high priest, and even though they were in the priestly line, and even though the standard for their kind of life was very high, they would live any way they wanted. And so they committed sexual orgies on the very steps of the temple, and God literally slew them both. They were slaughtered. The terrible consequence of this. You even have it in Hebrews chapter 12, where it says that the marriage bed is undefiled, but adulterers and fornicators God will judge. There are some things that harm us, and so we are to avoid it. Secondly, sexual sin not only harms, it controls. The second part of verse 12 says, all things are lawful for me, but I'll not be brought under the power of any. One of the things that this particular sin does, like all other sin, is that it makes people a slave. Someone was telling me in our church that there's a person who's come to our church who made the statement that he comes every Sunday for the sermon, and then he leaves and goes to pornographic movies in the afternoon because he just can't seem to free himself from the bondage of that terrible lust. It's a very enslaving thing. The more you give into it, the more it controls you. Enslaved is a good translation of the Greek word to come under the power or domination of. And what he's saying is, I'm not going to do anything that's going to enslave me. And that's what sexual evil does. It enslaves. It becomes a terrible, terrible bondage. Now, we see then that just from the very beginning, sexual sin has a powerful effect on us. It harms us and it controls us. But there's another thing, and that is it perverts us. Look at verse 13. Sexual evil perverts us. Just to show you this, there are three distinct purposes and designs for our bodies that get perverted by sexual sin. First of all, our bodies are, as Christians, for the Lord. Let's look at that in verses 13 and 14. Foods for the body and the body for foods. But God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God hath both raised up the Lord, and will also raise us up by his own power. Now Paul makes this point. He says the body is for the Lord. In fact, it ought to be obvious to you that our bodies are for the Lord, because someday he will raise our bodies. Someday, as he raised his own body, he will raise our bodies to dwell in glory. That's how much our bodies belong to his plan. The body is not for fornication. It is for the Lord. But he kind of mocks them because they had a little phrase, and he uses it at the beginning of verse 13. Foods for the body and the body for foods. By the way, in the Greek there are no verbs in it. It's just foods, body, body, foods. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, what they're saying is, well, that's a slogan. Food for the body for food. That's a natural function. And it was a little byword that they could use to speak of sex. And what they really meant was, well, sex is just like eating, the body for food and the food for the body for sex and sex for the body. It's simply a natural phenomenon. It's just a function like anything else. And that's what people are saying today. Oh, why do you get upset about sex? I mean, we're all sexual beings, Big deal. We just go out and express ourselves. We eat, we drink, we sleep, we walk, we run. We do these things. Why not have sex? It's only biology. Like Hugh Hefner says. He says, sex is a biological activity like eating or drinking, and there's no reason to get prudish about it. Find yourself a girl who's like-minded and let yourself go. By the way, I read that quote in Eternity magazine where he was quoted. Just want you to understand that.